The fluorescent lights of the Riverdale Community Center's multi-purpose room buzzed overhead as 6 a.m. rolled in. Folding chairs circled the polished hardwood floor, each occupied by white athletes in high-tech running gear, sleek compression tights, neon shoes, GPS watches flashing splits. At the center, a water cooler hissed softly, and the faint scent of rubber track mingled with leftover coffee. A laminated sign on the far wall proclaimed, Riverdale Running Club, all welcome, ages 18 to 60. Henry Johnson stood at the threshold, his tall frame draped in a well-worn navy windbreaker. His silver hair, cropped close, caught the harsh glare of the overheads, and his olive-green chinos and faded sneakers set him apart from the lycra-clad crowd. At 75, his gait carried the slight stiffness of years past, shins that ached during cold snaps and knees that creaked when he pivoted. Yet his eyes burned with undiminished resolve. Murmurs rippled through the room as he stepped forward, cane tucked at his side. Club President Randall Pierce, white early 50s with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a perpetual scowl, looked up from his clipboard. Henry, Randall said, voice edged with condescension, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is an age-restricted group. Our liability covers members up to 60. You're past that. Laughter bubbled around the circle as Randall's assistant distributed glossy flyers for the next under 40 speed clinic. Henry's jaw clenched. He'd been running these streets since high school, track meets at 16, a personal best of 3:42 for the marathon at 50, 20 miles a week through thick and thin. He took a slow breath, the chill of the morning seeping through his windbreaker. I've run Boston twice before, he replied evenly, voice steady despite the sting, and I'm not done yet. His cane tapped once on the floor, a metronome to his heartbeat. Randall shook his head, sliding his clipboard toward him. Look, Henry, this isn't personal, but we can't bend the rules. Why don't you try the Masters 5K group down the street? They only meet once a month. He gestured vaguely toward a corner where a flyer boasted 60-plus fun run, no timers, no pressure. Henry's throat tightened. He glanced at the other members, lean torsos in compression vests, calves sculpted like sculpture, their eyes a mix of pity and amusement. He remembered the marathon medals lined on his mantle at home, the countless dawn miles logged before sunrise, the unity he'd felt with runners of every age. Now he was cast aside. Yet beneath the flush of anger, a spark ignited. I'm not here for charity runs, Henry said, voice low but fierce. I'm here because I still have the legs and lungs to qualify for Boston. You can't tell me I'm too old for that. His cane struck again, once, twice, punctuating his words like drum beats. Silence fell so suddenly it pressed against Henry's ears. Even the hum of the water cooler seemed to pause. Randall swallowed. Henry, He glanced at the room full of white faces, young and fit. Maybe you should think about your health first. A single bead of sweat slid down Henry's temple, though the room felt cool. He straightened, eyes locking on Randall's clipboard. My health has never stopped me, and it won't start now. With that, he turned on his heel, cane tapping resolutely, and strode from the hall, each measured step marking a promise that he would prove his critics wrong, 1 mile at a time. At 5 a.m. sharp, Henry's alarm chimed through the dimness of his bedroom. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and planted his feet on the cool hardwood floor, where the scuff marks from dozens of early morning runs still faintly showed. In the corner, his small collection of Boston Marathon medals, polished brass circles suspended on frayed ribbons, caught the glow of the single bedside lamp. He reached for his birth certificate taped to the wall, turning its date of birth toward him like a talisman. July 12th, 1950. At 75 years old, he was bringing that number into the new decade of his life, ready to rewrite it mile by mile. After slipping on compression socks and a faded Brooks running jacket, its zipper pull smoothed by years of wear, Henry shuffled to the kitchen. He measured out 2 scoops of old-fashioned oats into a chipped ceramic bowl, sprinkled a handful of walnuts and dried cherries, then poured hot water from his stainless steel kettle. As the oats softened, he sipped a tall glass of water spiked with Emergen-C and surveyed his training journal pinned to the refrigerator. A spreadsheet of daily mileage, heart rate zones, and notes on knee stiffness. Today's plan: 3 miles easy pace to loosen up, followed by a swim session for active recovery. He wrote 3.2 miles at 9 minutes per mile in elegant script, then glanced at the clock, 5:25 a.m., and knew he had to move. Outside, the neighborhood lay cloaked in dawn's mist. Henry's knees ached during the first half-mile, a reminder of decades of pavement pounding and the meniscus tear he'd repaired 2 springs ago. But he settled into a steady cadence, heel, midfoot, toe, using the heel strike cushion of his worn sneakers to protect his joints. A white jogger passed him on the opposite sidewalk, glancing back with mild surprise at the elder endurance athlete forging ahead. Henry offered a nod, mind clear and focused. He ran the familiar 3-mile loop, past the shuttered bakery, under the oak arch of Elm Street, around the high school track where he had first learned the 400-meter interval drill. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured against the rise and fall of his chest. At 6 a.m., he left his sneakers by the backyard gate and slipped into his swimsuit for lap work at the community pool. The water was cool enough to make him gasp, but the buoyancy erased half the weight from his legs. He set a goal: 20 laps non-stop, using bilateral breathing and a smooth catch-and-pull stroke. Stroke after stroke, Henry felt the burn in his shoulders and the stretch in his hip flexors, muscles he rarely taxed on concrete. As the lane line bubbles trailed behind him, he visualized the long haul of the marathon, the punishing hills of Heartbreak Hill, the roar of the crowds on Boylston Street. The water carried away doubt. After 20 laps, he climbed out and wrapped himself in a sweat-soaked towel. Back home, he moved to the makeshift gym in his garage, a foam roller to massage tight calves, 3 sets of 15 goblet squats with a 20-pound kettlebell, 12 shoulder press reps with 15-pound dumbbells, and 2 minutes of plank holds. Each exercise was deliberate, each contraction a promise to his aging muscles. You will keep running. He finished with a slow yoga flow, downward dog into pigeon pose, quieting both body and mind. By 8 a.m., Henry sat at his kitchen table again, logging results. 3.2 miles at 8:58 minutes per mile, 20 laps, strength circuit complete. He added a note: knees stable, felt good on hills. Increased long run to 12 miles Saturday. The numbers glowed on the page like stepping stones toward Boston's qualifying standard. As sunlight filled the room, Henry leaned back, chest rising with pride and relief. He had rekindled the runner he once was, and nothing, not age nor skepticism, would stand between him and the finish line at Hopkinton this coming spring. When Henry knocked on the glass-walled door of Fleet Feet Training Center later that morning, his heart pounded almost as hard as it had at the start line of Boston in his youth. Inside, Margaret Lee, once a 2-time national marathon champion and now the center's head coach, was reviewing split-time charts on her tablet. Dressed in crisp white running shorts and a fitted gray hoodie, she looked every bit the consummate professional. Her pale skin glistened with a light sheen of post-run sweat, and her lean calves spoke of a lifetime on the roads. As Henry introduced himself, "I'm Henry Johnson. I want to run Boston again." Margaret's brow furrowed behind her black-rimmed glasses. She measured his silver hair and his well-used windbreaker, then arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Johnson," she began, voice measured, "I commend your ambition. But marathon training at 75 carries serious risks: cardiac strain, joint overuse. The average 75-year-old's VO2 max is half mine." Henry explained his medical clearance, his steady training logs, and his lifelong injury-free record. Yet Margaret remained reserved. "I'll give you 1 week," she said finally, "but don't expect miracles." She handed him a training plan displayed in neat columns. Monday hill repeats on Greystone Avenue, Wednesday tempo run at 7:20 minutes per mile for 4 miles, Friday long run progression reaching 15 miles, plus twice weekly strength and mobility sessions. Their first session, on a steep half-mile incline, was brutal. Henry's calves burned with every step, and his breathing rattled as he reached the summit. Margaret watched him passively, stopwatch in hand, as he logged each rep, then guided him through controlled descents. By the third repeat, his gait steadied. By the final one, he crested the hill with a nod. Not bad, she conceded, tapping her stopwatch. Over the next 5 days, Henry's pace improved and his recovery time shrank. Margaret modified the plan, adding an extra interval here, adjusting his mileage there, and each morning, as dawn broke over the track oval, she found herself offering quiet words of encouragement. Steady now, good form. You've got this. At the week's end, she sat across from Henry in the empty cafe, sipping her post-run latte. His cheeks were flushed with achievement. You've earned my respect, she admitted, eyes bright. Let's get you to Boston. In that moment, the reluctant coach became the champion of an extraordinary athlete, and Henry knew that under her guidance, age would be no barrier to his dream. The crisp autumn dawn found Henry Johnson standing at the start line of the Burlington Half Marathon Qualifier, bib number 75 pinned to his navy singlet. Around him, over 1,000 runners, mostly white, wearing sponsored compression gear and neon headbands, jogged nervously in place. The towering maple trees lining the course were ablaze in orange and gold, and a thin mist curled over the asphalt. Margaret Lee stood to one side, clipboard in hand, her sharp gaze following the older runner, whose silver hair glinted in the rising sun. At the blast of the starter pistol, Henry launched into the pack with deliberate strides, cadence set at 100 footfalls per minute, his GPS watch tracking each measure. He settled into his target pace of 8 minutes per mile, holding back the surge that younger legs easily summoned. White competitors surged ahead, jockeying for position, but by mile 3 his steady rhythm pulled him back toward the front half. Spectators, families in fleece jackets and college students in scarves, lined the course, cheering, "Go, Henry!" and offering high fives that powered his resolve. By mile 6, the rolling hills began. On the first incline, his knees flared a familiar ache, but he leaned into the rise, pumping his arms like pistons, and imagining the Boston qualifying standard shimmering ahead. Margaret's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Steady splits, Henry. Maintain the 1:44 pace." And he sliced the hill in 9:15, holding his form. At the peak, he swallowed air, thick with pine, and turned his shoulders downhill, extending his stride to reclaim the 8 o'clock pace. At mile 10, fatigue gnawed like fire, and several white runners passed him, heads bowed. Henry visualized the Hopkinton finish line and summoned a reserve he hadn't known existed. His calves burned, lungs seared, but he pressed on, the stopwatch ticking. 1:20 at mile 12. A final half-mile sprint, arms pumping, chest heaving, propelled him past 2 more competitors. Finally, he crossed the line at 1:44.12, arms lifted in quiet triumph. Margaret met him, her eyes glistening with pride. Around them, white runners and bystanders surged forward in applause. Henry had beaten the qualifying standard by 18 precious seconds and silenced every doubter who ever said a 75-year-old had no place on a Boston starting line. Before dawn's first light illuminated Hopkinton's sleepy streets, Henry Johnson stepped onto the pavement outside the start line, his bib, number 75 in navy and gold, secured firmly against his singlet. A cool breeze tugged at his windbreaker, and the scent of pine mingled with the faint hum of generators powering the audio towers. Overhead banners rippled gently. Boston Athletic Association on one side, 126th Boston Marathon on the other. White volunteers in bright neon vests directed runners into Corral G, the final wave, where Henry found himself surrounded by a sea of white-clad athletes, many decades younger and tuned to smartphones displaying wind and pace charts. As the cannon fired at 7:32 a.m., Henry launched forward at a measured 7:55 minutes per mile, mindful of Coach Lee's guidance to conserve energy on the first undulating miles. The narrow roads threaded between shuttered shops and colonial-era homes, their porches lined with white boards declaring, "Go Henry!" in marker strokes of blue and gold. Spectators, families in fleece, elderly couples in rocking chairs, children waving miniature flags, leaned over barricades, offering high fives that Henry accepted with a grateful nod, each tap of his hand sending a jolt of encouragement through his 75-year-old limbs. By mile 10, he had settled into a comfortable rhythm, steady breathing, upright posture, arms swinging along his sides. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the route as white runners streamed past him on the downhills, their calves pumping with youthful power. Yet Henry's strategy paid dividends, conserving muscle glycogen and protecting his aging joints for the punishing hills ahead. He focused on the crowd's roar and Coach Lee's words echoing in his earpiece. Maintain effort, not ego. Marathon is a chess game, not checkers. Approaching Heartbreak Hill at mile 20, the whitewashed crowd thickened into a living tunnel of cheers. Colorful signs bobbed overhead. Never too old, and 75 and crushing it. Henry's calves burned with each uphill stride, and memories of long-ago track workouts surged through him. He leaned into the gradient, driving his arms in the classic octagon style, feet landing softly mid-foot to protect his knees. With each step, the cheers crescendoed, the white faces in the crowd blurring into a mosaic of support. At the crest, he raised a fist in silent triumph and allowed gravity to carry him down the steep descent. In the final 5 miles, Henry summoned every reserve of grit. A white photographer on a ladder snapped a shot that would later grace the front page of the Boston Globe. Henry's silver hair and determined gaze framed in the cheering throng. As he entered Kenmore Square, the cityscape of Boylston Street beckoned. His pace quickened to 7:45 minutes per mile, a final surge fueled by adrenaline and unwavering resolve. When Henry crossed the finish line at 2:59:47, the first sub-3-hour marathon by anyone aged 75, the stadium erupted in shouts and applause. White spectators clapped and stamped their feet. Volunteers draped him in a ceremonial metal ribbon. Margaret Lee was waiting at the funnel exit, her eyes glistening as she embraced him. "You did it," she whispered. Henry, breath ragged but spirit soaring, managed a hoarse laugh. "Marathon never ages," he replied. In that moment, on the storied pavement of Boylston Street, Henry Johnson had not only defied the clock, but silenced every critic who ever doubted the power of perseverance. As Henry Johnson crossed Boylston Street and skidded to a stop before the glittering finish arch, his watch read 2:59:47, a full 13 seconds under the previous 75-year-old record, and, incredibly, beneath the standard Boston qualifying mark. The crowds lining both sides of the street erupted in a deafening roar. White spectators leapt from their folding chairs, fists punching the air. Children strapped to shoulders waved homemade signs reading, "Henry rocks and never too old." Volunteer medics and race officials swarmed to drape the finisher's medal around Henry's neck and assist him as he staggered into the recovery area. Every beep of his garment echoed in his chest like a victory bell. On the giant LED screen above the finish line, the official stats flashed: name, Henry Johnson, age 75. Finish time, 2 hours, 59 minutes, 47 seconds. Category record, sub 3 hours for 75 to 79. Age group. White news crews clamored for interviews. A CNN correspondent thrust a microphone at Henry's wind-shaken face. "Henry, how do you feel?" she asked, voice trembling. Henry's chest heaved, but his eyes shone. "I feel like proof that age can't cage ambition," he managed, voice rough with emotion. "This is for every runner who was told too old. We run by heart, not by years." Meanwhile, back at the Riverdale Running Club, which Henry had left behind in that scornful morning meeting, white members watched live updates on their phones. Randall Pierce, club president, stared at the screen in stunned silence as social media posts exploded with hashtags number Henry does Boston and number forever young. On the club's message board, the first comment read, "I stand corrected." By midday, major newspapers carried banner headlines. 75-year-old defies time to sub-3 finish. The Boston Globe. Elderly marathoner shatters age barrier. The New York Times. In op-ed pages, white commentators who had mocked Henry's ambitions the month before now penned mea culpas, praising his grit and calling for greater support of senior sports programs. On sports radio, a shock-tone host admitted, "I never thought I'd see the day. Henry Johnson, You've changed the game. That evening, Henry returned to his modest home, medal still hanging from his neck. He reviewed the flood of congratulatory emails, offers for speaking engagements, sponsorship inquiries, and a personal letter from the Boston Athletic Association inviting him to serve as Grand Marshal for next year's race. He sat quietly by the fireplace, medal resting on the coffee table, and closed his eyes. The echo of every dismissive "too old" had been replaced by thunderous applause. In that calm glow, Henry understood that the race he'd won was far more than 3 hours. It was a triumph over every doubt cast his way, a record not just of time, but of unbreakable spirit. 6 weeks after Marathon Monday, Henry Johnson awoke before dawn to the sound of his phone's alarm and the soft coo of mourning doves outside his bedroom window. He rose and stretched beneath the pale morning light, muscles still humming with residual fatigue from Boston's hills. Gone were the pain-racked mornings he once feared. In their place lay a quiet strength born of his record-breaking run. Pulling on his Navy Brooks trainers, he glanced at the small polished plaque on his bedside table, engraved with 2:59:47, 126th Boston Marathon, a constant reminder of what perseverance could achieve. By 6 a.m., Henry was back on the high school track where his journey had reignited. Coach Margaret Lee paced beside him, stopwatch in hand, as he laced his warm-up laps with the same meticulous form he'd used in his qualifier showdown. Around them, a dozen runners, white retirees and septuagenarians drawn by Henry's example, mirrored his every stride, their own dreams rekindled. Margaret guided them through drills, controlled hill repeats for strength, tempo intervals for endurance, gentle cool-down stretches to maintain flexibility. When Henry completed a final 400-meter sprint in 1:45, the group cheered, not for the clock, but for the inspiration he embodied. That afternoon, Henry stood before a packed hall of state legislators and senior center directors at the state capitol, the newly signed Active Aging Act tucked under his left arm. White senators and representatives, some who'd once doubted his ambition, rose in applause as he recounted his story, from the Riverdale dismissal to the Boston finish. He spoke of age not as a limit, but as a milestone marking the accumulation of life's lessons. If we can empower every older adult to move with purpose, we transform communities, slash healthcare costs, and redefine what's possible at every stage of life. The governor, white and immaculately suited, stepped forward to announce a $2 million grant for age-friendly running clinics statewide, citing Henry's run as its catalyst. By early evening, local news crews captured Henry, strolling through Concord Park alongside white community volunteers he'd recruited to lead free weekend Silver Stride sessions. Under his gentle guidance, participants tested the track for the first time, forging new friendships and swapping training tips. A group of white high school students from the Rural Youth Outreach Program joined, bridging generations as they jogged alongside Henry's steady pace. Cameras rolled as he high-fived a teenage girl who completed her first full lap, her grin as radiant as sunrise. That night, Henry returned home to find dozens of congratulatory messages on his kitchen counter. Letters from seniors whose lives he'd changed, invitations to speak at healthcare conferences, and even postcards from past Boston champions celebrating his feat. He hung a new bib, number 75, framed, next to his medals and plaque, the numbers shining like beacons. As he prepared for bed, he ran his fingers over the Active Aging Act text. Federal grant support for senior fitness programs. A quiet satisfaction filled him. By breaking the record, he had not only silenced his detractors, but ignited a movement that would keep countless others moving forward, mile after mile, age after age.